We're on book 6. That postcard art. And the full cover art. Okay. And chapter 92. Cave of 10,000 Gods. Faces of 10,000 gods hidden. Huacheng's breath was warm, but his words made Qielian's blood run cold. Could there really be someone hiding in the Grand Hall? A thought flashed through Qielian's mind, and he quickly returned Huacheng's embrace. He wasn't hugging him because he was afraid, of course. If there truly was someone hiding in the temple whom they hadn't noticed, then they must be a formidable character. And if that person sensed anything off, they might be forced to make a move. It would arouse suspicion if Huacheng was the only one hugging him and being so intimate. If the embrace was mutual, it might appear more natural. Qielian began to inconspicuously analyze their surroundings. "Where do you think they're hiding?" he whispered. There was only one entrance to the Grand Hall, which was the huge door they'd come through. The hall itself was completely empty. The whole room could be taken in at a glance, and there wasn't even a table or a chest that would provide a spot for someone to hide. Aside from the two of them, there were only the empty shells of the temple's attendants. "The shells," Qielian and Huacheng whispered in unison. The stone people were hollow inside, which meant they could serve as a hiding spot. A human couldn't get inside, but a ghost certainly could. When Qielian was sure they were both in agreement, he started to speak, but then he inadvertently looked up, and his pupils shrank. There was someone standing 6 meters behind Huacheng. This person seemed to have been a young man of higher status. These statues each documented a Wuyang citizen's death, so most were curled into balls or hugging their heads and wailing. This statue was one of the very few that was standing. But what made Qielian notice him wasn't his pose. It was his face. Although the stone person's face was barely distinguishable, Qielian could still make out some details. The left side was smiling, and the right side was crying. "It's that one," Qielian blurted. He drew his sword and struck just as Huacheng called out, "Gaga." The stone person shattered, and broken fragments of the shell scattered across the floor. Although there was nothing inside, Qielian didn't dare drop his guard, and he began turning over every single shard until Huacheng caught his hand. "Gaga, what did you see just now?" Qielian gathered a few fragments to show him. "Sunlang, that stone person, his face, it was White No-Face's mask." Huacheng's expression changed slightly, but still he said, "Wait a moment." He gathered and pieced together the shards. When the face was reconstructed, the two fell silent. Qielian had clearly seen a half-crying, half-smiling ghost face. But the face that Huacheng had reconstructed had indistinct features, no different from the other stone statues. Was it a hallucination? Had he been bewitched by an illusion spell? Sitting around wouldn't get them answers, so they searched the hall, smashing every stone person to ash as they went. But after giving it some thought, they realized that it was more important to deal with the others who were surely rushing to the summit at that moment. They decided not to stick around waiting for Pei Ming to return, and left the temple to scale the mountain. The mountain seemed to have a peculiar gravity. They tried, but the silver butterflies couldn't carry them, and flying on swords was a non-starter. They could only climb on foot. The higher they hiked, the steeper the path became and the colder the air grew. The snow was sparse at first, but it became thicker as they ascended until it could swallow almost half a boot. They were up to their knees in it after 4 hours of climbing, and their trek was becoming more and more arduous. Qielian didn't feel cold since they had been hiking nonstop. His face was instead covered in a thin sheet of sweat, and his red cheeks gave a shock of color to his powdery white face. He wiped away the sweat and looked back, about to speak to Huacheng, but suddenly his step caught nothing, and he dropped 1/2 meter. His body had sunk into the heavy snow. Thankfully, Huacheng had been following him closely, and pulled him up quite easily, like he'd been prepared for it. "Gaga, be careful." Qielian stood next to him, and looked back at where he'd stumbled. A large section of snow had caved in, revealing a deep, dark hole that led to somewhere unknown. If Qielian hadn't grabbed hold of the edge in time, or if Huacheng had moved too slowly, he would have fallen in for sure. "There are many holes like that in this area. I still remember their general locations, so just stay close to me," Huacheng stated. "Take your time and it'll be fine. Kuka was walking too quickly. As it turned out, the mountain's body was quite weak. There were holes everywhere beneath the snow, large and small, but how many and how deep was unknown. But as they climbed, it seemed Huacheng really did remember where all of them were. Jillian puffed a breath. All right, let's stick closer together, he suggested. In any event, we can't yell or make loud noises on a snowy mountain like this, so it wouldn't be easy to call for help if anything happened. He stopped when they heard angry roars coming from up ahead. Are you done? Which good brother just dared to yell like that on such a steep and perilous snowy mountain? Jillian was dumbfounded as he looked to the source of the noise. Amidst the snow-covered landscape, he saw two little black dots engaged in a fight, their weapons clinking and clanking. One of them held a longbow and was shooting arrows non-stop. The other held a janmado and swung with the vigor of a tiger. They struck down every single arrow. Both the blade and the arrows had a sheen of spiritual light, and both parties were shouting curses at each other. I already said I didn't kill that little bastard. I'm looking for them too, the man wielding the blade yelled. It was Nanfeng and Fuyao. Without even trying to guess why they had come here too, Jillian very nearly let out a shout of "Shut up!" However, he caught himself in time and swallowed it before he added to the noise. If he started roaring at the same way they were, and the three of them all began screaming at each other, could the snow on the mountain really remain still? Huacheng hugged his arms and cocked an eyebrow. Don't they know they'll cause an avalanche if they yell like that? They can't be that foolish, Jillian said. Maybe they do know, but that's just the way they are. They forget everything else when they're angry. Nanfeng and Fuyao were both furious and cursed at each other as they fought, but they were too far away from Jillian. He couldn't tell what they were fighting over from their broken, muffled phrases. And for their part, they completely failed to notice that anyone else had arrived. Jillian wanted to rush over and pull them apart, but there was no way he could make it there in time to stop them with the heavy snow dragging down his pace and the deep holes lurking beneath. He only managed to run 2 steps before he stumbled over another hole, and he came to a stop. We can't just let them keep fighting like this. We have to stop them. As soon as he said so, a silver butterfly darted past like an arrow. Jillian was startled, but relaxed a moment later. Good idea. If neither of them could make it in time, why not just use a wrath butterfly to fly over and transmit communication? As expected, the silver butterfly's speed was miraculously fast. It made it over to the brawling duo after only 3 more shouts. But before Jillian could try to speak through it, he saw Huacheng's expression turn cold. Jillian noticed something was amiss. What's wrong? The smile on Huacheng's lips had disappeared completely, replaced by a look that was as frigid as the snowy mountain upon which they stood. Sunlong, what's going on? Jillian pressed. Huacheng's lips twitched, but he didn't manage to answer before Jillian suddenly felt an inexplicable wave of panic. His head shot up to look at the top of the mountain, and his eyes widened. Giant chunks of the snowy white bluffs were trembling, and then they collapsed. Even engrossed in their heated fight, Nanfeng and Fuyao also sensed that soundless pressure. Both looked up, and they finally realized what was about to happen. The snowy mass was like an enormous embankment that stretched for 1,000 miles, and when in the next second it broke, it carried a snow tsunami along with it. It rumbled, rolled, and pushed down toward them. They had caused an avalanche. Jillian grabbed Huacheng's hand, turned, and ran. But after dashing a few steps, he remembered that the other two were much closer to that avalanche's charge. He stopped abruptly, looking back. Sure enough, they had ceased their aggression to flee together. Fuyao didn't get very far before stumbling into a hole and sinking down more than halfway. He was buried up to his chest in snow. Although Nanfeng ran faster than him, he hesitated for a moment and looked back, seeming like he wanted to save him. But the wave of snow was already bearing down. Jillian released Rolia the moment before they were swallowed. The white silk bandage instantly stretched far into the distance, lassoed Fuyao and Nanfeng with sharp precision, and yanked them up. Ugh, leave them, don't bother, Huacheng said darkly. Jillian held Rolia tightly, dragging the two as he ran. I can't! They might end up buried for 100 years if this goes wrong. Too late, Huacheng said, his voice dire. What? Jillian cried. He looked up, and the enveloping shadow bearing down overhead came crashing in. Nanfeng and Fuyao had stalled Jillian after all. The thick icy wave of snow surged relentlessly and swallowed him whole, separating him from Huacheng. The force knocked Jillian out everywhere, and he tumbled along with the coursing snow. Although he somehow managed to keep struggling, There was just too much snow, and the force was too powerful. Shilian was buried again and again, suffocating over and over each time his head went under. In the end, Shilian couldn't hang on. With a final shout of Sanlan, he was devoured by the icy snow current. An unknown amount of time passed before the snowy mountain finally calmed. A long moment later, somewhere in the field, a pile of snow shifted a few times before a hand burst out from underneath. The hand felt around randomly. Then an arm poked out. Then a shoulder, and then finally a head. Face covered in chunks of snow. He took a deep breath the instant he broke free, then let loose a flurry of coughing. Soon after, and with some difficulty, the man crawled his way out, shaking his head as he sat down on the snow. It was Shilian. Digging himself out from beneath that heavy layer of snow was not unlike his prior experience digging himself free from a grave. Shilian's face and hands were chapped red from frostbite, and essentially numb, but he only bothered to rub his face a few times and huff some hot breaths on his hands before looking up with a lost expression. There was not a trace of that captivating red in the sprawling blanket of white, and Shilian couldn't even call out for him. It would be all over if he caused another avalanche. He could only rise to his feet and wander aimlessly, all alone in that snowy world. He called out in a small voice as he walked, Sanlang? Sanlang? Nanfeng Fuyao? It was strange. Although he was walking the same path they had been hiking before, the air seemed so much colder than when he and Huacheng had been together. Rolya was also gone from his hand. Shilian was puzzled, as Rolya shouldn't have slipped off. It would still wrap itself around him even if he let go of it. So what happened? He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what, so he continued to wander in confusion. Suddenly, someone emerged from within the billowing snow ahead. His white robes and black hair flapped in the wind, and he kept his head down as he slowly approached. Shilian was delighted at the sight of this traveler, and pushed forward. "My friend, you—" But just as he spoke, the man looked up. He was wearing a chilling white mask, half of it smiling, the other half crying. Shilian screamed at the sight of it, as though he'd been stabbed. His eyes flew open at the sound of his own scream, and he shot upright. He panted harshly for several moments before his shaken mind could process that he wasn't standing on the snowy mountain at all. He was laying in a dark, shadowy place. So it had been a dream. No wonder something had felt off. Shilian exhaled a long breath as he relaxed, wiping away the cold sweat on his forehead. After feeling around for a bit, he determined that there was a flat stone beneath him, covered with a blanket of grass. Fangshin hung from his waist, and Rolya was wrapped snugly around his arm. Shilian steadied himself and ignited a palm torch to illuminate the room. He sat up immediately and called out, "Sanlang, are you there?" The moment the flames brightened the room, Shilian discovered that there was a person sitting right next to him in the darkness, soundless and silent. This was no small shock, and Shilian was awash in cold sweat as his hands flew to function. There was no way he wouldn't have noticed someone lurking so close by. However, the cold sweat dissipated when he looked closer. It wasn't a living person, but rather a stone statue, and not one of the many stone statues of the victims of the volcano's eruption. This was clearly a man-made sculpture. Palm torch in hand, Shilian scanned the room and was soon certain of where he found himself. The place where he lay was a cavern for cultivation. He had once gone into seclusion to cultivate in a place like this, so he was familiar with this type of chamber. It meant that the sculpture inside the cavern was not a regular statue, but a divine icon for worship. The divine statue had been erected in a cavern with an arched ceiling. Its figure was long and slender. Its bearing was natural and relaxed, and its pose was graceful. Its right hand rested on the hilt of the sword at its waist. It had been sculpted with sublime skill. Even the flowing lines and folds of its robes were exquisite. However, there was something peculiar about it. The face of this divine figure was covered by a light veil. The veil was light as flowing smoke. While it was quite strange to see a divine statue with its face obscured like this, it wasn't ugly. Instead, it added a mysterious sort of beauty. Shilian had never seen a divine statue like this, displayed with its face covered. He unconsciously reached out to pull the veil off, but was interrupted by a voice from behind. "Gaga." Shilian's head whipped around. A figure in red had appeared at the entrance of the cavern without him realizing. It was Huacheng. The mysterious face of that divine statue instantly went to the back of Shilian's mind, and he rushed over to him. "Sanlang! Thank goodness, I was wondering where you were. Are you all right? Are you hurt? That avalanche was so sudden." Huacheng entered the room. "I'm fine." "How's Gaga?" "I'm always fine," Shilian said. "What is this place?" Once he left the cavern, it became clear that this place was far more expansive than expected. The corridor he found himself in seemed quite long, and who knew where it led. Xilian had long ago gotten used to Huacheng having the answers to everything, yet this time he replied, "I don't know. Most likely under the snowy mountain." Xilian was amazed. "And I thought it was a shelter Sanlang had found. I can't believe even you don't know where we are." Well, this was a first. Huacheng had memorized the location of every ditch on the mountain path, but he wasn't familiar with this place. The cave network clearly wasn't small. Had he really never stumbled upon it before? Picture. Xilian couldn't help but find it a bit strange, but he didn't press the matter, and instead raised his palm torch higher. "How did we get here?" Huacheng summoned a few silver butterflies, and let them flutter about to shine their faint light. "Maybe we stepped wrong and fell into a ditch," he replied evenly. That was the only logical explanation, as the alternative was that someone had intentionally put them here. Xilian couldn't help but recall the dream he'd just had, and a slight shiver went down his spine. Remembering something else, he asked, "We're here? So where are Nanfeng and Fuyao?" At the mention of those two, a trace of hostility flashed across Huacheng's face. "Probably buried in the snow. Who cares? They're heavenly officials. This won't kill them," he replied unsympathetically. Xilian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Even if they can't die, it still won't feel great to be buried for decades if no one helps dig them out. Maybe they fell in here too, so let's search for them. By the way, Sanlang, what did you hear them say when your silver butterfly flew over? Huatsung snorted. "Just some meaningless argument, as if it could have been anything pleasant." Xilian doubted it was that simple. Otherwise, he couldn't explain Huacheng's sudden change of expression when the wrath butterfly overheard the fight. Even now, Huacheng's eye was extremely unkind as he snorted. But if he wasn't going to tell, then Xilian wasn't going to pry. The two continued down the cave's long corridor. After walking for a while, they discovered this stone tunnel beneath the snow was much more complex than they had initially thought. There wasn't just one path straight through, but many forks that branched off into various other caverns, large and small. And every one of those caverns held a divine statue. Some of the figures were teenagers. Others were young men. The statues were all in unique poses, in lazy repose, leaning as though intoxicated, sitting poised, dancing with a sword. The clothing was also ever-changing. Magnificent ceremonial robes, plain clothes, rags, half-naked and more. The level of skill differed between sculptures as well. Some of the work was rough and unrefined, while some was so extraordinarily exquisite and detailed it was astonishing. They probably hadn't all been sculpted by the same person, but the sheer number of them and the wealth of varieties made this a spectacular sight. Xilian admired them as they walked, and he couldn't help but exclaim in awe, "This is a cave of 10,000 gods. I wonder who chose to build one in this place. They must have been an incredibly devout believer." However, all the divine statues shared the same peculiarity. Their faces were covered by light veils. Some of the veils were large enough to cover the statue's whole body, revealing only the hem of its robes or its feet. Xilian really was quite curious and wanted to pull the veil from a divine statue to see its face, but Huacheng spoke up behind him. "Guga, I suggest you don't." Xilian looked back. "Why not? Doesn't Sanlang think these statues are odd?" Huacheng approached him with his hands clasped behind, and explained, "It's precisely because they're odd that it's best you don't uncover them. If someone covered their faces, they must have had a reason. Spiritual energy gathers in the head, and we can't be certain how the spiritual energy these strange statues have gathered would react if a veil is removed." He paused for a moment, then continued, "Guga, weren't you searching for your two servants? Since we haven't found them yet, it'd be better not to touch these statues. Best to avoid any unexpected complications." While his explanation sounded slightly far-fetched, it made logical sense. It wouldn't be a laughing matter if removing a veil awakened something within these statues. Xilian wasn't prone to touching what he shouldn't. He thought it over and, in the end, dropped his hand. "I was only curious which deity these sculptures depict. That's all." There was something else strange. Huazhen was not the kind of person who feared unexpected complications. If they saw what that veil covered, so be it. Xilian hadn't expected him to use that as the reason not to touch them. "This is the kingdom of Wuyong, so they're probably the crown prince of Wuyong," Huazhen said dismissively. Nothing notable. Shilian countered, I don't think so. Oh? What do you mean? Hua Cheng asked. Shilian gazed at him. Judging by the murals we saw along the way, the clothing worn by the Crown Prince of Wuyong and the Wuyong people was particularly bright in color. As the country existed 2 millennia ago, the prevailing style of dress was ancient and coarse, and a little wild. The clothing on these divine statues is quite different, though. I don't think these statues have anything to do with the Crown Prince of Wuyong. In fact, the sculptor might not have been from Wuyong at all. Hua Cheng smiled brightly at him. Is that right? Gaga really has an eye for detail. Shilian also smiled. No, it's simply that the style of these statues, the sculpting work, the clothing design, and the way the details such as the flow of the dress are handled, all looks like something from a later period, and it's one I'm more familiar with, too. The style of Xianle. Hua Cheng quirked his eyebrows. It seems Gaga is also deeply gifted in this topic. No, it's nothing. You'd naturally gain a bit of knowledge after seeing a lot of something, and that includes divine statues, Shilian said, although he couldn't quite put his finger on it. His instincts told him there was something off with Hua Cheng since he'd awoken. It was only now that he finally realized what was amiss. There was a subtle sort of nervousness about him. However, Shilian still didn't pry. He said instead, since Sanlang thinks it's best not to inspect them, let's stay cautious. Hua Cheng gave a light nod, and the pair continued onward. Soon they came to another fork in the road, and Hua Cheng headed left without hesitation. Shilian paused and didn't follow. Hua Cheng looked back. What is it? Sanlang's never been in this cave before, right? Shilian asked. Of course not. Then why are you so sure that we should go left? Not sure, necessarily, Hua Cheng said. I'm just choosing blindly. Since you've never been here before, how can you charge forward blindly? Shouldn't we consider which way to go more carefully? Hua Cheng smiled. We should go blindly precisely because I've never been here before. No matter how cautious we are, we know nothing about this place's layout, so we might as well boldly bet on our luck. And my luck has always been better. Although that certainly made sense. Hua Cheng had always let Shilian choose the way when they went out. It wasn't often that he took the initiative and led. Shilian nodded. They were just about to enter the tunnel on the left when Shilian hastily spoke up. Wait, Sanlang, do you hear that? What? To the right, Shilian said. There are voices. Hua Chen's expression changed subtly, and after listening intently for a while, he said, Gaga, I think you're mistaken. There's nothing there. There is, Shilian insisted. Listen closely, it's a man's voice. Hua Cheng tried listening again and frowned. I really don't hear anything. Shilian was taken aback. Am I hallucinating again? He wondered. Your Highness, there's something fishy about this. There might be tricks afoot, Hua Cheng said. I suggest we talk after we get out. Shilian hesitated for a moment, but in the end he still declared, No, it might be Nanfeng and Fuyao. I must go take a look. Then he dashed off down the path while Hua Cheng called after him, Gaga, don't run off! But whoever had been shouting must have fallen into an extremely dangerous situation that allowed no delays, and Shilian didn't dare to be careless. He continued to rush down the right-hand path. The farther he went down the tunnel, the clearer he could hear a man's angry roars. Shilian was delighted. It really is Nanfeng and Fuyao. Shilian didn't know how long he'd spent hurrying through the winding tunnel, but he finally found the source of the voices in a giant cave. There were no divine statues in this cavern, but instead a deep pit. And that pit was precisely where Nanfeng and Fuyao's screaming was coming from. It looked like they were both trapped at the bottom, unable to climb up, but they were still yelling passionately at each other, so their lives likely weren't in danger at the moment. It was too dark in the depths of the pit to see anything clearly. Shilian cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted from above, Hey! What happened to you guys? When the two in the pit heard someone up above, they instantly stopped arguing. Fuyao's reply came first. Your Highness! Is that you? Hurry and pull us up! Nanfeng, on the other hand, didn't speak. Shilian was puzzled. You guys can't climb up on your own? The pit isn't that deep. What's happening down there? Perhaps it was because he'd been fighting the entire way, but Fuyao was full of fire. If we climb up on our own, we would have done it already. Can't you see for yourself, Your Highness? Shilian squinted. Well, I can't see much right now. Do you still have spiritual power? Can you light a palm torch so I can see what the situation is down there? If you can, I'll throw a fireball down. Before he could finish his sentence, the two at the bottom yelled in unison, Don't! Their voices rang with alarm and terror. Do not light any fires, Fu Yao yelled. If he couldn't light a fire, he'd have to find another way to illuminate this place. Xilian's first reaction was to look behind him. However, there was no one there. Huacheng hadn't followed him. Xilian was surprised. At first, he felt slightly uneasy, then confused. There was surely no way Huacheng could have lost his way, right? Huacheng had been acting quite strangely ever since they entered the Cave of 10,000 Gods, but Xilian couldn't quite put his finger on why. He looked to his left and right, then discovered a tiny silver butterfly resting on his shoulder. He touched it tentatively. Hello? The wrath butterfly fluttered at his touch, but didn't fly away. It seemed to want to show him its wings. Over the course of their journey, Huacheng had told Xilian that his silver butterflies fell into various categories. Xilian didn't know which category this one belonged to, or what its duties were, but it could at least shine some light regardless of its purpose. Thus, he asked, "Can you go down and take a look for me?" Sure enough, the silver butterfly fluttered its wings and flew into the pit. Xilian called out his thanks and waited until it reached the bottom. Once the soft silver light illuminated the situation below, Xilian couldn't help but widen his eyes. The bottom of the pit was covered by an eerie field of white. The entire hole was blanketed with a thick bed of silk. Nanfeng and Fu Yao had been tied up with that silk so thoroughly that they'd been bundled into 2 cocoons, like 2 little flies stuck in a spider's web. Their faces were battered black and blue, and their heads were covered in blood. But they might have done that to each other during their fight earlier. Xilian couldn't help but give himself a pat on the back for his caution. The entire pit might have been set ablaze had he thrown down a torch. "What's going on?" Xilian asked. "Is that a spider's web? Could this be an arachnid spirit's lair?" "Who knows?" Fu Yao yelled, desperate to escape. "We can't break free anyway." Nanfeng, on the other hand, bore an unreadable expression. At first, he looked like he also wanted to call for help, but he'd sullenly swallowed his words when he'd seen that Xilian was the one who'd come. "Don't come down yet. The spider silk is really tough," Nanfeng said instead. "It'll be hard to break free once it grabs you." "I won't come down," Xilian said. After deliberating for a moment, Xilian tied one end of Roya to the hilt of function, planning to lower the sword just to see if it'd work. But Roya had only crept down halfway before the web discovered it. Tendrils of silk shot upward with violent intent at the interloper. Roya coiled away in terror, but it was too late. The webbing snagged the bandage, wrapped around it, and yanked it down, pulling Xilian in as well. Xilian had never imagined that this web would be so strong and cunning. The moment Xilian fell into the pit, the white tendrils of silk charged forward and trussed him up. The rest of the silk tendrils crawled along to further secure the cocoons that trapped Nanfeng and Fu Yao. Fu Yao was absolutely furious. "How come you fell in too? Now look at us, 3 stupid fools. Let's all just die here together." "What are you griping about?" Nanfeng shot back. "This only happened because he was trying to save us." Xilian, on the other hand, was tumbling about and laughing. Nanfeng and Fu Yao looked at him dumbfounded. "Did you hit your head on the way down? Have you lost your mind?" Fu Yao asked. Tears rolled from the corners of Xilian's eyes, and he said with much difficulty, "No. What's with this web? Why is it so ticklish? I can't." The silk bed had caught him gently when he fell, and the tendrils that had bound him seemed to touch him with care and love. They brushed softly against Xilian's body while they worked, as if they were tickling him. Xilian curled into a ball, fighting with tenacity. "No, don't! Wait! Stop! I give! Stop!" Only then did the white silk tendrils bind his hands behind his back and stop their ticklish dance. Nanfeng and Fu Yao stared at him. A moment later, Fu Yao simply said grumpily, "How come it was so rough when it tied us up, but so lenient with him? It hasn't even covered his face." Xilian finally caught his breath. Aren't your faces uncovered too?" Fu Yao rolled his eyes. "They were covered. We had to use our teeth to tear holes after we woke up. We couldn't have shouted otherwise." Xilian tried struggling a bit, but the silk webbing was tough and unyielding. Plus, his ribs faintly hurt from laughing too hard. For now, he was out of commission. He decided to relax a bit, lying down flat. "So how did you two end up here?" "Don't know," Fu Yao replied. "When the avalanche hit, snow came crashing down on us. When we woke up, we were already here." No, Xilian said. "I mean, why did you come to Mount Donglu?" Fu Yao was furious the instant the topic was raised. I was pursuing that ghost woman Lancheng and the fetus spirit. Who knows why he's here? Me? I'm here to chase after the mother and that mother and child too, Nanfeng answered. Then why didn't you go after them? Fu Yao spat. Why did you hit me? My general already said that he had nothing to do with the fetus spirit. He didn't kill either of them. His goodwill was taken for ill. There's honestly no point in trying to be a good person. Shilian mediated out of habit. All right, stop. I understand the situation now. Stop fighting, stop arguing. You're the one who caused that avalanche, so can you just give it a rest? Let's think of a way out together. However, Nanfeng was incensed. Does your general really not realize how he usually acts? He has no right to complain if people are suspicious of him. Fu Yao glared. What did you say? I dare you to say that again. Nanfeng glared even harder. I do dare, and I will say it again. You never had goodwill for anyone. You just want to show benevolence to people you can't stand, so you can secretly feel all smug about it later. You're after your own satisfaction, and you love to watch everyone else make fools of themselves. Don't give me that goodwill taken for ill garbage, and don't you dare think that you're a good person. Genuinely good people aren't like you. You've never been one. Veins popped in Fu Yao's forehead, and his lips began to twitch. You've made all that up. It's pure nonsense. You know best whether it's nonsense, as if I don't know you, Nanfeng shouted. The veins now bulged all the way down Fu Yao's neck. What right do you have to lecture me? Looking down on people from so high up? Careful, you might fall and break a leg. I'm better than you at everything, Nanfeng yelled. Do you think no one knows about that shitty stunt you pulled back then? The mere mention of this mysterious incident seemed to inflame Fu Yao even more. His fire fueled by shame. Yes, I admit I did it, but how much better are you than me, really? Acting like you're the model of loyalty. Didn't you ditch the boss too when you got a wife? Didn't your wife and son suddenly become more important? Everyone does things for themselves. Everyone makes themselves top priority. Aren't you embarrassed to keep hanging that ancient shitty deed over my head? When he heard wife and son, Nanfeng's outrage exploded. You! Although neither could move, they were so intent on their argument that they didn't realize the way they addressed each other had slipped. They had dropped your general and my general in favor of you and me, and in their fury, they had completely failed to notice what this exposed. Only now did they realize their error. Shilian had long since stopped talking. Nanfeng and Fu Yao both whipped their heads over to look in Shilian's direction, and saw that he'd silently flipped on the silk bed, turning over and only showing them his back. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. Shilian faced the stone wall as he politely asked, Are you two going to keep this up? I won't comment on anything else you were discussing, but, I do think that someone's wife and son should be most important. There's nothing wrong with that. It's basic human sentiment. But all this ancient history, let's not stew in it. Let's think of a way to escape. You already knew? Fu Yao cut him off. Since it didn't seem like he could get away with it any longer, Shilian could only concede, Yeah. When did you find out? How did you find out? Fu Yao said in disbelief. Shilian didn't have the heart to tell the truth. Instead, he replied, I forget exactly. The real answer was that he'd known everything for a very, very long time. He'd already vaguely suspected it on Mount Yujin, and by the time they set foot in Banyue Pass, he'd confirmed it. These junior martial officials from the middle court, they didn't actually exist. Nanfeng and Fu Yao were merely clones created by Fengshen and Muqing. Fu Yao seemed like he couldn't believe his real identity had been seen through so easily, and he began to relentlessly interrogate Shilian. When? How? There must have been something that gave it away. What was the flaw? Shilian really couldn't bear to tell him the truth. There weren't any secrets to give away because they had flaws all over them. The three grew up together, after all. How could Shilian not recognize the way they behaved and spoke? From the sloppy fake names to the completely unchanged personalities, it was too easy to guess. If he hadn't realized who was behind those two skins, he would have lived all these years for nothing. There was always some things one couldn't say, and some things one couldn't do. For example, one couldn't easily roll their eyes or cuss when minding their behavior as a heavenly official, but they could be much freer and more relaxed when wearing different identities. Thus, Shilian never felt the need to expose them. Fu Yao, no, Now he should be called Muching, gritted his teeth and said coldly, "So, you've known who we are for a long time, but you never said anything. You quietly watched us put on an act. Am I correct?" And that is chapter 92.